this is Brad Bailey. We're here, this is October 25th, 2018. We are downtown New York on 13th Street, and this is the oral history interview for the National Park Service and the LGBT Community Center Oral History Project with Shelley Montrose. Nice to have you here today.
Thank you very much.
So can you tell me, where were you born?
Born in New York.
Where you born, where you from, and what date?
Okay, I was born in New York, Mineola, Long Island. I'm from New York, Harlem, and I was born December 23rd, 1956.
Okay, and so Mineola and Harlem, essentially.
I grew up in Long Island.
Okay.
And I live in Harlem now.
All right. And so, can you tell me a bit about your childhood?
Middle class. Well, I grew up in an apartment buildings out in Long Island. First, I was living with my grandparents, and then we moved to our own house. And so I grew up in Amityville, Long Island. And then we moved to Queens, and then after that I moved to the Bronx and into Harlem when I grew older.
And what type of work did your parents do?
My mother was a phone company employee, and my father worked in construction.
And so, tell me a bit more about your childhood. What type of, what was your childhood like growing up?
Oh, it was good. I went to school, which is in the neighborhood, and I had a good education. It wasn't, I didn't suffer discrimination then, because it was mostly a mixed group of children in the school. It was black and white. We had no problems in grade school or anything. I didn't really feel the racial disparity until I got to high school. Because when I went to junior high school, there were some people of Caucasian people. But when I got to high school, there was none. And this is in the Northeast Bronx, but most of them went to Catholic school at the time in the 60s.
So you say
and 70s.
You say you didn't discriminate, you said in high school there were no Caucasians?
Very rarely.
Okay.
Okay. Children. Teachers were Caucasian.
So when did you say you first experienced discrimination then?
About that time of high school and things like that.
Because there were no Caucasians, or because there were?
Because there were no Caucasians.
Okay. How would you explain?
Well, I'm not saying there were no Caucasians resulted in discrimination. I just knew of the differences. I realized the differences that since there were no Caucasians in my school as participants, I could see the differences between the teachers and the students.
Okay. And so you said you were born in 1956.
Yes.
So that would make you 13 around the time of Stonewall.
Yes.
So can you tell me, did you identify as LGBT?
Not back then.
Okay.
Not then, not till I was about 30s. But I heard about the Stonewall riots and everything because I was surprised that something would happen here in New York City.
Okay.
So
what was your experience? Were you around during that time? Or did you go to the actual event itself?
No. My mother wouldn't let me out of Mineola.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. But I did hear about it on the news, about the riots, and like I said, I was surprised that this would happen in New York City, this type of discrimination. Because I didn't feel any type of differences in myself at that time. But until I got older, then I felt the differences that I knew I wasn't like everybody else. I wasn't straight.
In what way do you mean that? When did you start understanding?
Because okay. So in high school, I could feel different than any. So in high school, I knew I was different because I didn't want to have kids. I didn't want to be with guys. I didn't know what it was that I was, but I knew I wasn't straight. I wasn't like everybody else. And not until I was about 30 that I experienced my attraction to women.
And how did that manifest itself?
Just saw some women I liked. Just saw some women that she could recognize that I was different than anybody else because I kept watching her. So.
Where was this?
This was at some place in the Bronx.
Okay.
In a person's house, a party.
Was she gay? Was she straight?
She's straight.
Okay.
She was straight, but she could recognize that my looking at her was different than looking at guys.
Did you end up having a relationship at all, or?
Yes.
Okay.
It was rather brief, but it was telling to me that I didn't, since I was not attracted to men, it had to be the attraction to something else, to the other opposite, the other sex. So. And that's when I realized when the Stonewall Riots happened, when I realized what my sexuality was, I said that's what made an impression on me when that happened, because I remember what I was doing when I was 13. I wasn't interested in anything, but I remember that Stonewall Riots, what happened.
What do you remember? I know you were only 13. Do you remember? I guess you didn't go down to the area.
No,
okay.
no.
So when did you eventually start interacting in that community more full time?
Oh, when I was 30s. Okay. I would go to the bars all the time and came to the center a lot. And mostly it was the Duchess that I was going to.
So that was around 1986 then?
Early 80s.
Early 80s.
And before that, I was coming down to see to the Women's Center, where they had a karate club and the Women News newspaper. And I got involved with both those things.
So tell me about those.
Yes, the Women's News was a free newspaper for women that detailed everything that's happening in the city in the early 80s, mostly to do with lesbian and women events that were free around the city, and some that were costly. But it was produced, it had a readership of, I think, a couple of 100,000 in the city at the time. It was started by some women, early 70s, I believe. And eventually I came to work for the Women News as a book reporter, book reviewer, entertainment reporter. And I did a lot of plays and some musicals and reading about books, and reported about the Women's Motorcycle Club also that was happening, that was growing, and all the other events that were happening for Black women that were coming up in the community. So I reported about those things. The also thing at the same time, like I said, I had come down to learn karate at the Women's Center, from the Women's Center Karate Dojo, and I eventually became a green belt in the karate movement. So those were the two things that drew me into the community, more or less. And I kept up with it, so.
So can you talk to me about the dynamics of growing up LGBT and a woman of color, and a color of, maybe you could talk about sort of those dynamics, maybe through your childhood and then maybe into adulthood?
Okay. It was a little hard because also at the same time, my parents were involved in the NAACP, which was striving to get people of color, our rights, to secure our rights. But they never mentioned the word LGBT. That was not part of the vernacular. That was not part of anything. So I kept that part hidden from them. I did not discuss that, I was feeling this way. Eventually I broke off from them because they were also involved in two groups that would discriminate against me, being that I'm a lesbian. So I eventually just stayed into my own community, okay? And I could see the differences between NAACP activist work and the LGBT activist work. And I didn't feel like I could fit into either one at one time, because the LGBT was mostly white people and the NAACP was mostly straight people. So I felt kind of in the middle. As I grew older, I eventually came out to my father. My mother had passed away by then. And I told him how I felt. And he accepted, and so did my sisters and my family. So eventually, I accepted that part of myself, and I grew to become involved with the black lesbian activist groups that were taking place, which was, at one time it was called Salsa Soul, it's now called Alus. And I had joined them and did things with them, more or less. That was still different from the NAACP work that my parents would be doing. So I still didn't feel fit in with them. And that's the problem that we have still now, because we're still not inclusive especially in the church, of the black church, or any activist group. Still is discriminating against LGBT people. So that's the only difficulty that I see now. Because what do you call them? I wouldn't say the Trump administration, but the bureaucratic administrations recognize NAACP activists more than they do LGBT activists. And activism, they will give them more than they will give us anything. So it's still a struggle to get any type of rights to secure any type of rights we have with the black people, black activist groups not accepting LGBT activist groups together. So that's the only problems we have. That's a big problem. It's not the only problem.
And so, with regard to, talk to me about that. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot. The only way I see it is as more and more as we come out more and more in the church, that makes it seem more acceptable to the black community that we are still here and we are part of the community, and we should be accepted as, not being part of the norm and being discriminated twice as much as the black community is. So they are slowly accepting us, very slowly.
So talk to me then about how black women of color, or especially African American LGBT females, or identified as females, fit into the framework in the LGBT community?
Oh, we do. We're, especially at Pride, at one time we were the second group that was in the march behind the women motorcyclists. We would be the second listed group behind so we'd be in forefront of everything. Now, Alus is about the third or fourth group. So we're still in the forefront. We're still being noticed. We still know. We have meetings all around the city. People do come to the Alus groups. We have a lot of events that we go to we are activists. We're also a part of the African American Day Parade they've accepted us into that parade. So we are slowly getting into the black activism forefront, so they notice where we are.
But but the thing is, what about also potentially either sexism or racism inside the LGBT community? Can you discuss that?
Okay. There is a problem. about transgender women coming into the lesbian world. We have, it's still, okay, it's still a hard thing to accept that this person has now transitioned into becoming a woman and wants to join us when we still see them partially as men with the male privilege. It's slowly being accepted. We're slowly, coming to grips that they're being discriminated against as transgender, and they should be accepted into our thing. But it's hard for women to do that. It's very hard for women to say, okay, you can come into our world, like when we have a thing called Michigan Fest, which was our music festival that housed. It's now ended because of this question of transgender women coming into our world. I've not participated in that, but I have participated in another small festival called Sister Space, where we did accept transgender women. So it's slowly coming. It's slowly coming. And we're trying to stay in the forefront of keeping the discrimination down in our community with other lesbians. We don't discriminate against color, that's for one thing. So, but it's just a little hard to do with that. But it's slowly coming. Slowly we're accepting transgender women into our community. Not without a fight, but it's happening.
I mean, but in terms of, what do you mean by that fight, though?
It's still hard to, because for one thing, I know it's not a popular thought, but it's my thought. Why do you still think of yourself as trans? If you transitioned and you want to be a woman, just say you're a woman now. Don't say you're trans. Trans means you still have one leg as a male, and you're going to keep that. That's what's the problem with, you want to keep that part of you. But if you want to be a woman, you have to be all woman. You have to say you're a woman. I don't care if you're a straight woman now, but you have to say you're a woman, and you have to think as we think if you want us to accept you.
So why do you think that's important?
Because, and I understand the discrimination of people, they don't feel, I think it's twofold. They don't feel that they're being accepted as trans. But if you're transitioning, I don't care if you even had the surgery. You want to be known as a woman, you have to finally transition completely and say you're a woman. If you want to say you're a man, you're saying now I'm just a man. I'm not a trans, but you're a man. I'm finally going to live my life as a man, as my true self. Okay, then I can accept you. But this trans part still sticks in some women's craws, that you still want to keep that leg in the male world. And if you do, then you're not a real woman.
So in terms of some of the major changes you've seen from your work in the 80s to now.
Go ahead.
To now, what were you going to say?
No, there has been a lot of changes between the, we are more accepting of women, Caucasian women, Asian women. We're more accepting of everything that's women, where we used to be standoffish against white women because they were standoffish against us and discriminated, but it's not the case anymore. It's evolved where we're all women. We're whatever color we are, we're all women. And everyone accepts that. And there's different types of relationships where it used to be just black women accepting only being in a relationship with other black women. Now you take anything, as long as they say they are women, it doesn't matter. Even formerly trans women, as long as you have, like Samantha Cox, she says she's a straight woman now, but I still think that woman is hot. So, you know, we're accepting of everything. If you want to be a woman and I'm attracted to women, then sure.
So also, I was curious as to, with regard to the legacy of Stonewall. What do you think that legacy is?
Well, the one thing,
And if you could tie in the work you do, and how, I guess, what is the legacy of Stonewall in relation to the work you do with LGBT women of color?
okay. The legacy of Stonewall to me is that we were being totally discriminated against by a small majority of the country that was criminal in nature because it was owned by the mob, Stonewall. So why should they discriminate against us when they're a criminal enterprise? So that has evolved where now we have our own, we own the Stonewall place. We own different buildings. We own different businesses. We're no longer discriminating because we don't own things. Just like in the Black community, we own our own destiny. We own our own businesses, our own lives. So it's equal now in terms of parity, where LGBT and people of color are on the same level, if not a little, sometimes a little higher, a little lower. But since Stonewall, we've broken free of that oppression that the world saw us as nothing but dirt. Now they see us as something, not necessarily dirt, but they see us as people. People of LGBT and people of color. They see us as human beings also. They may not like us, but that's besides the point. They still recognize us as an adult human beings. And with that, it becomes the legacy of Stonewall almost trumps the legacy of Dr. King.
Oh, really? Why would you say that?
Because it frees us up. Dr. King fought for everybody's freedom. Stonewall fought for LGBT freedom. So, and it comes down also between the sexes, between the genders. Women were so much discriminated, even more than people of color were enslaved. We were treated as, even after people of color were treated as good, women were still treated as second class, third class, fourth class citizens. So people of color were now on level, parity level with Caucasian males, but the women were not. So now we have a harder road to get to. So I say it's not, Dr. King's message was very good for the people of color, but now Stonewall's message was for added other discrimination that trumps, that throws off the oppression from the bureaucracy.
So now, next year being 50 years of the anniversary,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think is the most important lessons that need to be sort of learned now for the future?
That we have our own destiny in our own hands. That we will no longer have to depend on anything from white America. We can control ourselves and our destiny. That's the big thing.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It was great talking to you.
I hope I said something meaningful.
Oh, you were great.
Sometimes